On the 17th of June 1940, in the space of about 20 minutes, more British lives were lost than in the sinking of the Titanic and the Lusitania combined, and almost nobody outside a small circle of survivors and historians has ever heard the name of the ship where it happened, the HMT Lancastria, a converted Cunard liner that became, in a single ferocious afternoon off the coast of France, the worst single incident loss of life in British maritime history, a catastrophe so politically inconvenient that Winston Churchill himself ordered the press to stay silent, and for decades the story sat buried beneath the noise of Dunkirk, a more palatable evacuation that the nation needed to believe in. To understand why the Lancastria was even there, you have to rewind a few days earlier, to the collapse of France. While the world remembers Dunkirk as the dramatic rescue of the British Expeditionary Force in late May and early June, that evacuation only pulled troops from the northern coast, and it left behind tens of thousands of British soldiers, airmen and support personnel scattered across central and western France. Men from supply units, training depots, and Air Force ground crews who now found themselves trapped behind a German advance moving faster than anyone in London or Paris had anticipated. With the French government collapsing and Wehrmacht columns racing toward the Atlantic coast, the British launched a second, far less famous evacuation, codenamed Operation Ariel, a chaotic scramble to pull out everyone they could from ports like Cherbourg, Brest, and especially Saint-Nazaire, a deep-water harbour on the Loire estuary that briefly became one of the most important and most dangerous points on the map. The Lancastria, a 33-year-old vessel originally built as the RMS Tyrrhenia and later renamed and refitted as a luxury Cunard cruise liner, had been requisitioned by the Admiralty at the outbreak of war and converted into a troop ship, and by the morning of June 17th, she was anchored several miles off Saint-Nazaire, too large to dock directly at the damaged port facilities, waiting to take on evacuees who were being ferried out to her by smaller vessels. What followed was a textbook case of desperation overriding caution. Official capacity guidelines for the Lancastria, under peacetime maritime law, would have capped her passenger load at around 3,000. But these were not peacetime conditions. German forces were closing in on the coast, and the order of the day was simply to get as many people aboard as physically possible. Estimates of how many souls were ultimately crammed onto that ship vary, because complete embarkation records were never properly kept in the chaos, but historians generally agree the number was somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000 people, a staggering range that itself speaks to how disorganized and rushed the loading truly was, men, women and children packed onto every deck, into corridors, lounges and cargo holds, some having waited hours in small boats just for the chance to climb aboard. The ship's captain, Rudolf Sharp, a veteran mariner who had survived the sinking of another vessel earlier in his career, made the difficult decision to keep loading passengers even as the situation grew more precarious, reportedly under pressure to take on as many as the ship could hold before departing for England. Overhead, the threat was not theoretical. German Luftwaffe aircraft had been harassing the evacuation all day, and other ships in the vicinity had already come under attack, yet the Lancastria remained at anchor, a massive, motionless target sitting in open water with no real means of escape if the bombers came. At around 3:45 in the afternoon, they did. A lone Junkers Ju-88 broke through and released its bombs directly onto the ship, and at least one, possibly more, struck home. With horrifying precision, one bomb, reportedly plunging straight down a funnel into the engine room, another tearing through decks packed with people who had nowhere to run. The explosions ignited fuel oil that had been stored in the ship's tanks, and within minutes thick black crude was spreading across the surface of the water, fires breaking out, and the Lancastria, mortally wounded, began to roll and list with terrifying speed. Survivors would later describe scenes that defy easy narration, people trapped below decks as water poured in, others leaping from the rapidly tilting hull into water thick with burning oil. And amid the smoke and chaos, witnesses reported hearing voices rising in song, including the hymn, "There'll Always Be in England," sung by men and women who understood, in that moment, that they might not live to see it again. In less than 25 minutes, the ship that had carried thousands disappeared entirely beneath the waves of the Loire estuary, and what followed was a desperate, hours-long rescue operation, as nearby vessels, fishing boats and aircraft worked to pull survivors from oil-choked water. Some swimmers slicked black from head to toe, others suffering severe burns from ignited fuel that continued to blaze on the surface even as people tried to swim through it. When the toll was finally reckoned, even rough estimates placed the dead at somewhere around 3,400 people, though because no one ever established a precise figure for how many had boarded in the first place, the true number of lives lost may never be definitively known, and that uncertainty is itself part of the tragedy. An entire catastrophe swallowed by imprecision and wartime urgency. Almost immediately, the British government moved to suppress the story. With France on the verge of total collapse and British morale already strained by the trauma of withdrawal from the continent, news of a disaster this immense, larger in loss of life than Dunkirk's military casualties, was deemed too damaging to public confidence to be released, and a formal news blackout was imposed, with the story not permitted to surface in British newspapers until weeks later, by which point the narrative of the summer of 1940 had already been written around the defiant spirit of Dunkirk, rather than the horror in the waters off Saint-Nazaire. For decades afterwards, survivors and bereaved families fought for recognition. Official documents relating to the sinking were sealed for extended periods, and many of those who lived through it carried both physical scars and a profound sense that their suffering had been erased from the national memory. Today, the wreck of the Lancastria still lies on the seabed of the Loire estuary, designated a protected war grave, and a memorial service is held each year to honour those who perished. A quiet, dignified counterpoint to the silence that once surrounded this disaster. The sinking of the Lancastria stands as a stark reminder that the history we're taught is often the history that was convenient to tell, that courage and tragedy do not require headlines to be real, and that somewhere beneath the waters of a French estuary, thousands of ordinary people, fleeing chaos, hoping to go home, met an end that history nearly succeeded in forgetting.